Vivid verses.
I remember the exact moment I knew I was good at reading people. I was 11 years old, sitting at my father's dinner table in our house on Callaway Street, watching my Uncle Bernard explain why he needed to borrow money for the third time that year. He had a different story each time: a medical bill, a car repair, a business opportunity that would pay back double. But the stories all had the same texture underneath, the same slight over-explanation, the same way his eyes moved to the ceiling when he was calculating rather than remembering. My father gave him the money anyway, every time. He was a generous man. But afterward, when the house was quiet and I was supposed to be asleep, I'd hear him at the kitchen table, sighing in a way that said he'd known the outcome before he'd written the check. That's when I understood something important. Knowing and acting are two separate disciplines. The knowing is the easy part. My name is Callum Reed. I'm 34 years old. I run a mid-sized logistics consulting firm called Stratum Advisory out of a building on Fenwick Avenue in the financial district of a city called Harrow Cross, a place that doesn't exist on any map you own, but feels like every city you've ever lived in. We have 22 employees. We turn a clean profit. I wake up at 5:45 every morning, run 4 miles along the river path that borders Kessler Park, make a breakfast that I could probably recite from memory, and get to the office before anyone else. I'm not telling you this to impress you. I'm telling you so you understand what I'm like before Mara. I met Mara Voss at a fundraiser dinner at the Ashford Hotel, one of those medium-sized charity affairs where 60 people sit at round tables pretending the proximity to philanthropy is the same thing as performing it. My colleague, a good-natured woman named Priya, had dragged me along because her date had canceled and she didn't want to sit alone at a table with her boss. Mara was seated 2 seats away from me. She had dark hair pulled back in a way that looked intentional without being fussy, and she wore a deep green dress that suggested she understood how colors worked in a room. She was a brand strategist at a consultancy called Vellum and Park. She was funny in a dry, observational way that I found genuinely disarming. She made a joke about the centerpieces, elaborate floral arrangements that were slowly wilting under the heat of the overhead lighting, and I laughed before I'd consciously decided to. We talked for most of the dinner, continued talking at the bar afterward when the formal portion dissolved, and exchanged numbers in the lobby at 11:15 with a mutual understanding that this was going somewhere. For the first 4 months, it went somewhere excellent. Mara was sharp. She had opinions that she'd actually worked out, not just inherited. She read widely. She cooked exceptionally well and seemed to find genuine pleasure in feeding people. She had a close group of friends, a woman named Pia, 2 friends from university named Rob and Gemma, who I liked and who seemed to like me. She met Priya and charmed her effortlessly. I was aware, in those early months, of something I can only describe as ease. I'm not someone who relaxes quickly. My default mode is observation, analysis, a kind of low-level vigilance that I've carried since childhood. With Mara, the vigilance didn't disappear, but it sat quieter. I noticed things about her, small things, but I file them as data without alarm. The way she occasionally restated a compliment I'd paid her as if she needed to hear it twice. The way a cancel plan could shift her mood for a full evening. The way she sometimes asked questions that already contained their preferred answers. None of it alarmed me. People are complicated. I filed it and moved on. That was, looking back, the most important mistake I made. Not the filing, the moving on. Month 5 was when the texture started to change. It was gradual enough that I imagine most people would have rationalized it away, told themselves it was a phase stress, something external. Mara had a difficult client at work. Her lease was coming up for renewal, and her landlord was being difficult about terms. These were real pressures, and I gave them their appropriate weight. But there were things that didn't fit those explanations. She began checking in more frequently when I was at work. Not occasionally, not out of legitimate interest, persistently, in a way that had a rhythm to it. A text at 9, another at 11, a third around 2 in the afternoon that was always framed as a casual remark, but functioned as a location check. When I was slow to reply, because I was frequently in meetings or deep in analysis, the follow-up messages had an edge that was new. Just wondered where you were. Forgot you existed for a minute there. Must be nice to be so busy. I didn't fire back. I don't fire back. I noted it, responded warmly and directly, and watched to see if it was a pattern or an anomaly. It was a pattern. Month 6 introduced the manufactured crises. This is what I came to call them privately, manufactured crises, because after enough exposure, I could recognize them for what they were. They weren't real emergencies. They were tests or pressure mechanisms or bids for attention that had escalated beyond their original purpose because the original purpose had been rewarded too many times. The first significant one happened on a Tuesday. I had a dinner scheduled with 2 potential clients visiting from out of town, a meal I'd been preparing for professionally for 2 weeks. At 4:30 that afternoon, Mara called in a state of distress. She'd had a falling out with Pia. It was devastating, she said. She needed me. Could I come over? I felt the pull of it. That's the thing about manufactured crises. They're built around genuine emotional mechanics. The distress sounds real because it's adjacent to real. I asked the relevant questions. Was Pia physically okay? Was Mara? Yes and yes. Was there any immediate danger or emergency? No. I told her I had a client dinner I couldn't cancel, but that I would come directly afterward, that we'd talk through everything, that Pia and she had been friends for years, and this would be survivable. There was a silence on the phone that was meant to communicate injury. I stayed warm, stayed firm, stayed on the line until the silence passed, and then I went to my dinner. When I arrived at her apartment afterward, the situation with Pia had, as I predicted, mostly resolved itself via a flurry of texts. Mara was not in crisis. She was, however, measuring whether I would come, and she had her answer. The problem was that her answer was, yes, eventually. I should have understood, then, that I was negotiating the terms of a slow erosion. Partial compliance teaches the same lesson as full compliance. It just teaches it more slowly. By month 8, I had a fairly complete inventory of the patterns, the check-ins, the manufactured urgencies, the way she reframed my professional commitments as personal slights, as if choosing to honor a work obligation was a covert statement about her worth. The slow campaign to reduce my independent plans, my monthly dinners with 2 old friends from graduate school, Owen and Sasha, began to generate predictable friction. Not prohibition, nothing so overt. Just friction, a planned conflict, a mood that lasted until I assured her at length. The friction was enough to make the plans feel costly, which was, of course, the point. She was also, I observed, excellent at repair. After a difficult period, she would pull back to the version of herself I'd met at the Ashford. Warm, funny, engaged, interested. Generous in ways that felt specific and thoughtful. She'd cook the meal I'd mentioned once in passing that my mother used to make. She'd find a book I'd referenced and leave it on my desk with a handwritten note that showed she'd read the back carefully. She was smart enough to intersperse the pressure with genuine tenderness, which kept the whole architecture from becoming legible all at once. I want to be honest about something. I cared about her. That's not a small admission for me. The ease I'd felt in those first months was real. The version of Mara that existed before the pattern solidified was someone I genuinely admired. Understanding that the patterns were a problem didn't erase the affection. It just meant I had to be clear-eyed about what the affection was attached to. I'm not someone who ends things hastily. I believe in direct communication. I raised the check-ins with her calmly one evening in month 7, sat across from her in her kitchen with a cup of coffee, and explained, without accusation, that I'd noticed a pattern and that I wanted to name it because I thought we were good enough to have the conversation. She was disarmed by the directness, I think. She cried. She told me her last relationship had involved significant dishonesty and that she carried anxiety about it, that she was still working through. She was seeing a therapist. She wanted to do better. I believed her. I adjusted my expectations forward rather than backward, which is what you do when someone offers a credible account of themselves and a stated intention to grow. Month 8 proved the growth hadn't come. The patterns returned and had added a new element, the public appeal. At a small dinner party at Rob and Gemma's apartment in the Fairhaven district, 8 people, good wine, the kind of evening I genuinely enjoy, Mara made a comment about my work schedule in front of the group. It was framed as lighthearted, the kind of thing that could be dismissed as a joke, but it had teeth. Callum's married to his spreadsheets. We all compete for the scraps. Laughter around the table. I smiled, said something mild and unrevealing, and felt the shift in the room that happens when something social has been used as a delivery mechanism for something else. Later, in the car, she asked if I was upset. No, I said, which was accurate. I wasn't upset. I was decided. That was the moment, actually, not a dramatic one, just a door closing quietly from the inside. I didn't move immediately, not from hesitation, from discipline. When you've decided to end a relationship that has become genuinely unhealthy, the timing and the manner of it matter. I didn't want to do it in reaction to the dinner party comment, because then it would look like a reaction to the dinner party comment, and she would be able to reframe it that way to herself and to others. I want to be measured. I wanted to be clear. I spent about 2 weeks quietly completing the inventory, making sure I wasn't missing anything, making sure I was acting from settled understanding rather than accumulated frustration. I wasn't angry. I want to be precise about that. Anger would have made this easier in some ways and harder in others. What I felt was something closer to clarity with a residue of genuine sadness underneath it. I had wanted this to be different. It wasn't. I arranged to see her on Saturday evening. I suggested we cook at my apartment, a familiar, neutral space where we'd spent many genuinely good evenings. I didn't want a restaurant with its implicit audience and its escape-proof quality. I didn't want to do it at her place where the environment was hers to control. My apartment was right. I had the conversation planned. Not scripted, I don't script, but organized. I knew what I needed to say and in what order. She arrived at 7. She was in good spirits. She brought a bottle of wine, a Morven Cellars Red that I'd once mentioned was a favorite, and she seemed lighter than she had in weeks. I noticed this without softening. We had dinner. It was a good meal. We talked about work, about something funny that had happened to her on the subway that morning, about a documentary we'd both been meaning to watch. She was, in those hours, the version of herself that I'd fallen for. I stayed present and warm and entirely clear in my own mind. After dinner, when the plates were cleared and we were sitting across from each other with the wine, I told her I wanted to talk about something important. She set down her glass. Her expression changed in a way that was hard to read, somewhere between knowing and afraid. I told her, calmly and without accusation, that I thought our relationship had become unhealthy in ways that I tried to address and that hadn't changed. I named specific patterns without exaggeration or drama. I told her that my decision to end it was not about not caring for her. I did care, but that caring for someone and being in a relationship with them are different choices, and I'd concluded the relationship wasn't good for either of us. I told her I hoped she'd continue with her therapist and that I believed she was capable of the growth she'd described. I told her this clearly, looking at her directly, speaking without anger or pleading or cruelty. She listened. Her jaw tightened once. She looked at the table and then back at me. And then she said, "I'm pregnant." I let the words sit in the room for a moment. Okay, work with what's in front of you. Don't react to the timing, analyze it. This arrives at this exact moment, after I've just finished the clearest, most measured statement of my position. That's information. I'm not proud to admit that the timing was my first calculation, but it was. 11 years of watching my uncle's eyes move to the ceiling had given me an involuntary instinct for the shape of a move. I also want to be honest about something else I didn't know for certain. I'm not omniscient. The calculation didn't equal a verdict. A coincidence in timing doesn't make something false, and I was aware of that. I stayed with that awareness. I looked at her. Her eyes were wet, though no tears had fallen yet. Her hands were folded on the table in a way that looked deliberately composed. Okay, I said. My voice was even. Congratulations. She blinked. That wasn't what she'd expected. Callum, I mean that genuinely, I said. If you're pregnant, that's significant news, and I want to respond to it appropriately. I paused. Here's where I am, and I'll be completely honest with you. I will fully support this child financially. I will be present as a father, consistently, reliably, in every way that matters. That's not contingent on anything. I held her gaze. But I'll need a DNA test once the child is born, because that's a responsible position given where we are in the circumstances. And I want you to know clearly, the pregnancy doesn't change my assessment of this relationship. Well, I told you before you said it is still true. I've thought carefully about it, and I know my own mind. We can co-parent respectfully and well. I believe that. The silence that followed was long. She started to say something 3 times before the words came. She told me I was cold. She told me I was the most calculating person she'd ever met. She told me she didn't know how she felt about the DNA test. She told me this wasn't how this conversation was supposed to go. I said, I know this isn't easy. I'm not trying to be cold. I'm trying to be honest. The two things aren't the same. I didn't elaborate beyond that. I didn't defend myself against the word calculating. Describing me accurately isn't an insult. She left about 40 minutes later. She was not in tears, which I noted. People in genuine shock tend not to maintain that level of composure. But I reminded myself again that I was reading, not deciding. The verdict wasn't mine to render unilaterally. Time would do what time does. Those 2 weeks were, in practical terms, straightforward. Mara contacted me several times. Long messages that cycled through different emotional registers, sometimes wounded, sometimes conciliatory, sometimes barbed. I responded to each one with brevity and consistency. I asked in the 3rd or 4th exchange when she'd scheduled her first prenatal appointment and whether she wanted me to be present. She deflected. I noted the deflection and continued to ask every few days with the same quiet regularity. I also did what any reasonable person in my position would do. I called my friend Owen, who is a family law attorney, and had a frank conversation about my legal position. Not because I decided the pregnancy was false, because knowing your legal landscape is prudent regardless. Owen walked me through the process. He told me what I already knew about paternity testing. He reminded me to document my communications. He told me, in the way he sometimes tells me things, that he hoped it wouldn't come to that. I told him I hoped so too. At work, I was fine. I've always been able to compartmentalize cleanly, not in an avoidant way, but in the way of someone who understands that problems don't improve when you carry them into rooms where they don't belong. My team was working on a complex realignment project for a distribution client, and I gave it the focus it deserved. Priya noticed I seemed slightly quieter than usual, but didn't press. I thought about Mara more than I'd expected to. Not with longing, with something more like grief, the functional kind that runs alongside your ordinary days without stopping them. I thought about the early months. I thought about the dinner at the Ashford, the wilting centerpieces the way she'd laughed at her own joke before she'd finished making it. I thought about whether there had been a version of this story where the outcome was different. I concluded there probably had been. I concluded that the version required her to do work she either couldn't or didn't choose to do. Both of those are real possibilities, and I had no way to know which one was true, and the distinction didn't ultimately change anything about my position. On the 12th day, she texted, "Can we talk? Not about what you're thinking. I just need to say something." I replied, "I'm available tomorrow evening." We arranged to meet at a coffee place in the Carlo Row neighborhood, a small, quiet spot called Hendrix that we'd never been to together, which I thought was better. Neutral ground, no shared history with the location. She was already there when I arrived. She'd chosen a corner table, which told me she'd thought about the conversation. She had a coffee she wasn't drinking. She looked like she hadn't slept especially well, and I noticed, with the particular quality of attention I try to bring to things I'd rather not notice, that she did not look like someone who had been nauseous in the mornings. Violet. I ordered tea and sat down across from her. For a moment, she didn't say anything. She turned her cup in small circles on the table. I'll let the silence exist. I don't fill silences as a policy. Not because I'm performing patience, but because I've found that most silences, if you leave them alone, will eventually fill themselves with the truth. "I wasn't pregnant," she said. She said it to the table, not to me. Then she looked up. "I know," I said, which wasn't entirely true. I'd known it was possible, maybe probable, but not certain. But in the moment, it was the clearest response to what she'd given me, and it happened to be true in the way that mattered. She flinched slightly. "How long?" "From the timing," I said, "and a few other things." I didn't elaborate. She looked at me for a long moment with an expression I couldn't fully categorize. Not shame exactly, something more complicated, an emotion that had multiple components, some of which were still defending themselves. "I needed to know," she said, "whether you'd stay, whether you actually loved me, or whether you were just—" She paused. "I needed to see if you'd fight for it." I considered her words carefully before I responded. There was something sincere in them. I thought, a genuine description of her internal logic, even if the logic itself was badly constructed. I wanted to honor the sincerity without validating the action. "I understand that's what you needed to know," I said. "And I'm sorry the relationship left you feeling uncertain enough to need to test it that way. That's something I should sit with." I held her gaze. "But what you did is a serious thing. Not just to me, to yourself. Testing someone's commitment with a false pregnancy isn't a way to get information about their love. It's a way to get information about how they respond to a high-pressure scenario, which isn't the same thing." She looked like she might argue. She didn't. "And the information you got," I continued, keeping my voice level, "is that I responded to a high-pressure scenario by maintaining the position I'd carefully reached over 8 months of paying close attention. That's accurate information, actually. That's exactly what I do. I'll let that settle. But I don't think it's the information you were looking for." She asked me what the information she was looking for would have looked like. I said I thought she would have felt most reassured if I'd abandoned my stated position. If I'd said the pregnancy changed everything. If I'd agreed to stay in a relationship I'd concluded was unhealthy because the prospect of fatherhood had overridden my judgment. That would have looked like commitment to her. To me, it would have looked like something else. She was quiet for a long time. I drank my tea. The coffee place was almost empty, just us and 2 people near the window reading separately, unbothered. "I don't know what I was hoping would happen after," she said finally. "I didn't think past the first part." "I know," I said, and I meant it simply, not as condemnation, just as a true thing. She asked if there was any chance. I told her no, and I told her why in terms that I believed were honest and kind and completely clear. I told her I didn't think she was a bad person. I think she was a person with a particular set of fears that had been left unaddressed for long enough that they developed their own methods of operation. I told her that the work she needed to do wasn't about me, and that the relationship she was capable of having on the other side of doing that work was probably a genuinely good one. She cried then, not the controlled, deployment-ready tears I'd observed during some of our earlier difficult conversations. Something more authentic, I thought. Less composed. I handed her a napkin from the dispenser on the table and didn't try to manage it. We sat for another 20 minutes. The conversation wound down the way conversations do when they've said everything true they have to say. I paid for both coffees. She didn't argue about that. We walked out onto the street and stood on the pavement for a moment in the late afternoon light. "I am sorry," she said. "For the whole thing." "I know," I said again. "I think you should tell your therapist what happened. Not to be directed, because I think it's useful material." She made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh, but had a laugh's edge. "You're something else, Callum. I've been told," I said, not unkindly. We didn't hug. That seemed right. She turned and walked toward the Carlo Rose subway entrance, and I watched her for a moment. The green dress replaced by coat, the hair down now instead of pulled back, and felt the grief do what grief does when it's acknowledged honestly. It shifted. It didn't leave. It just settled into a more accurate shape. I walked home along the river path that runs through Kessler Park rather than taking the subway. It was cold for the season, a sharp, clarifying cold, and the path was nearly empty. I run this route every morning and know it well enough that I can let my mind move while my body manages the rest. I thought about Mara. I thought about the architecture of it, the way it had been constructed to exploit the things that make people want to stay in relationships, the warmth and the laughter and the specificity of attention. I thought about whether I'd missed something I should have caught earlier, whether there'd been a moment when a different move would have yielded a different outcome. I concluded as honestly as I could that the answer was probably not. The patterns I'd observed weren't the result of my actions. They were pre-existing, installed long before I arrived. I had been, in some sense, the environment in which they expressed themselves. That's different from being the cause. I also thought about what she'd said, whether you actually loved me. It was the question underneath all of it, I realized. The manufactured crises, the check-ins, the public comment at Rob and Gemma's dinner party, the pregnancy announcement in the exact moment when she'd felt most exposed. All of it was a single question in different forms. Are you here? Will you stay? Can I trust this? The tragedy of it, if that's not too large a word, is that the methods she'd chosen to answer the question were precisely the methods most likely to destroy the thing she was trying to protect. Every test corroded the foundation. Every manufactured crisis spent a small amount of the real capital. By the time the final move arrived, the largest, most drastic test of all, there was nothing left to protect. I understand that kind of fear. I'm not immune to it. I just carry it differently. I got home, made dinner, and sat at my kitchen table with a glass of the Morven Cellars Red that she'd left behind, which I poured and then didn't particularly want. I thought about calling Owen, but decided there was nothing to report that required a phone call. I texted Priya to say I was available if she needed me for the distribution project Tuesday. I sat with the quiet for a while. Then I did what I always do when I've finished working through something. I put it in its proper place in the orderly internal architecture where I keep the things I've understood, and I moved on. The next morning I was up at 5:45. I ran my 4 miles along the river path in the dark before the city woke. The air was still cold, the path still quiet, and by the time I crossed back into Kessler Park, I felt what I reliably feel at the end of a run. Cleaned out, clear, present. Back at my apartment, I showered, made breakfast, and checked my phone. There was one message from Mara, sent the previous evening after I'd gotten home. I read it. It said, "I realize I've been terrible to you in ways I couldn't see while I was doing them. I'm not asking for anything. I just wanted to say that. I appreciated the message. It was the clearest, most undefended thing she'd said to me in months. I thought about what to write back. I thought about whether any response from me would serve her well, whether a warm reply would prolong something that needed to end cleanly, whether a brief acknowledgement was more kind than leaving it unanswered. I landed on brevity. I received that, and I appreciate it. Take care of yourself. I put the phone face down on the counter. Then I poured my coffee, opened my laptop, and started the day. There was work to do, and I was good at it, and the work didn't care about any of this, which was, that morning, a kind of relief. 3 weeks later, when she sent 2 more messages in 2 days, carefully worded, not hostile, but carrying the familiar cadence of re-engagement, I recognized the pattern for the last time. I sat with it briefly. I felt the residue of genuine feeling that was still present and would probably be present for some time. Then I thought about my father at the kitchen table on Callaway Street, sighing at the cost of a thing he'd already known wouldn't work. The knowing and the acting. 2 separate disciplines. I opened my phone, pulled up her contact, and blocked the number. Not with anger, not with satisfaction, with the quiet completeness of someone who has finished the inventory, understood what it contains, and made the correct and necessary decision. I set my phone on the desk. Outside the windows of my office on Fenwick Avenue, Harrow Cross was doing what cities do in the late afternoon, going on, indifferent, alive with small purposes. Priya was somewhere down the hall working on the distribution report. Owen had texted about dinner next week, him and Sasha, a place they wanted to try in the Fairhaven district. I wrote back, Thursday works. See you there. Then I turned back to my screen and returned to the work that was in front of me, which was like all work worth doing, both difficult and clear.
Thanks for listening.